Hi, and welcome to MindSet, an HCD vidcast, where we dive into the world of applied consumer neuroscience and market research with leading experts in the field. My name is Michelle Nagella, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and Director of Research and Innovation at HCD.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose, the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD. As your hosts, we are going to act as the buzzkills for the buzzwords, taking time to critically think about the limitations and pitfalls of emerging trends and topics within the field to help you identify what innovation has a lot of untapped potential or is too good to be true.
Now, HCD is a full-service research house which provides research capabilities on consumers by looking at how they perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, such as looking at product experiences, communications, or just general consumer and shopper experiences. We use a combination of tools that come from psychology, physiology, neuroscience, as well as the traditional methods that people typically use to see how they experience different stimuli. That stimuli can range from the early stages of exploration all the way through the final product validation tests. This is what we refer to as applied consumer neuroscience.
So stick around for more curious conversations as we chat our way through the ever-evolving space of consumer science.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our MindSet vidcast podcast series. You're back with Kathryn and myself, and we are super excited to have a guest join us once again. So we're going to have some cool conversations, and Kathryn's going to introduce her in just a second.
Yes. Hi, I'm so excited to introduce Falisha. Falisha, I'm going to let you do a more formal introduction about exactly just who you are and what your background is and why we're chatting today.
Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Falisha Karpati. I'm an inclusion consultant. I work primarily with research and scientific organizations as well as academic institutions to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace as well as in research. I have a background in neuroscience. I completed my PhD in neuro at McGill University, where I studied the impact of training on the brain. And then prior to launching my consulting practice, I worked as a training and inclusion professional for a large-scale government-funded neuroscience research initiative. And I bring brains into everything that I do. So my approach to inclusion is really centered on the intersection of cognitive, demographic, and experiential diversity. So I strive to build spaces where everyone's identities, experiences, and ways of thinking are fully embraced and everyone's set up for success.
So we like to bring brains into everything we do too. I really like that as far as the tagline. But, for our listeners that maybe aren't really as familiar with this area, I was wondering if you could maybe define a little bit two things for me: inclusion and inclusion consultant. Like what do those mean?
So in defining inclusion, I also want to define how that's different from diversity, because sometimes they are used interchangeably and they are quite different. So when we talk about diversity, the diversity is a fact. There's difference within a group. So you can have gender diversity, racial diversity, cognitive diversity, any trait, you can have diversity within a group. So it's important to know that diversity is a group term. An individual is not diverse, a group can be if there are different identities represented. Whereas inclusion is an action. It's making sure that everybody in the group feels that they belong, have equitable opportunities, and have what they need to be able to succeed in the classroom, in the workplace, or whatever environment we're working in. So as an inclusion consultant, I work with different types of organizations. As I mentioned, personally, I'm mostly research science and academia. So I work with them to help make sure that their spaces are inclusive, that their lab environments are set up for all different types of students and researchers, that classrooms are accessible and provide positive learning environments for all different types of students. and in workplaces as well, to make sure that everything from hiring procedures to promotion to the content of research and products are designed with inclusion in mind.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I was really curious. Would you mind just sharing what are some of the benefits that a company would have by hiring you to kind of help understand this a little bit better throughout their organization and try to really design a bit more to be inclusive and to really start to implement those types of things that you were just sharing with us?
There's so many benefits both within the organization and externally. So by building inclusive environments in a workplace, employees will be more productive, well-being will be much higher, because if team members are not feeling like they belong or they don't feel that they're being treated fairly, that's really going to impact mental health in addition to productivity. And inclusive spaces breed psychological safety, which means that people are more likely to speak up if they have a question or an issue or raise concern with something that might be going on, and to share new ideas that might be different from what's been done before. And that's really necessary for innovation and to keep things moving forward. We have to be open to new ideas, and that's only going to happen if people feel like they're included and that their voice is welcomed.
Can you tell
more
us
than
a little
welcome
bit
that it's
about-
embraced?
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about how you bring the neuroscience and the brains into your work?
So that comes in several aspects. One of them is cognitive diversity. So the way that I define cognitive diversity is differences in how individuals perceive and process information. And that all happens in the brain. So we look at how different types of brains through neuroscience research, we'll look at how different ways of thinking are correlated with different brain structure, different brain activity, but also behavior. So what can organizations do to make sure that that their environment is providing a positive space for example, for introverts and extroverts, for neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, for those who experience mental health conditions, for people with different types of training and experience, even that impacts our brains. And then it also comes in when we talk about bias and belonging. So mitigating bias is a huge part of creating equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces. So I use the biology of bias in the brain to help educate people on where it's coming from. The fact that we are all biased, and the fact that it doesn't make you a bad person, that's how our brain is wired. And I find that's really valuable in getting people to accept the fact that bias happens and we need to do something about it.
I think that that's a huge problem, like a neuro myth, we like to call them, that I think people think that brains are all the same. Right? I think they make this assumption that if you're measuring people's brains, at least this is how it goes a lot of the time in marketing research or consumer research, they make this big assumption that if they use physiological measures, that people are there's going to be less variability. When in fact, I think we talk about this a lot, that you almost have more variability, right?
Everything that we do impacts our brains.
Yeah.
So for example, when you're talking about the consumer studies, one thing that comes to mind is a previous study that I personally led, looking at how brains are different between dancers, musicians, and people without dance or music training. And there are noticeable differences there. And if you're, say, doing a study looking at a commercial and there's music in it, and all of your participants are musicians, their brain activity is not going to be representative of the general population, because they're going to be reacting in a certain way to the music.
But what does even general population mean when there's so much diversity among people, right? I think something our fearless leader, Glenn Kessler at HCD says a lot is that a lot of times when you get these norms and metrics for people, that you're really just measuring mediocrity, right? Because you've boiled everybody down to some simplistic average, when really there's a huge range of reactions in the way your brains work and the biases that you might have, the experiences that you might have that color your experience that you're having with a product or an ad or whatever it might be. So I think that's really interesting to think about there. What is Gen Pop?
Definitely. I think when we're looking at averages, I mean, that gives us one piece of information that is valuable. But one thing that I strongly advocate for is looking at subgroups and see how those compare to the group averages. Is there a certain group, whether that's a gender identity, age group, people with experience in a certain field of work, that is reacting differently? Right. And why is that happening? And do we need to change something?
That is so interesting. And do you think that you could explain and dive a little bit deeper into those subgroups? What type of demographics should we really try to consider when you're trying to be inclusive and representative and understand what is really inside that general population?
So the first thing is to define what, as we were talking about before, what is the general population? And that's really going to be different depending on what the study is, because there are some studies in all fields that are relevant to what I would consider the general population, everybody. There's no reason why any particular group should be excluded from that. But sometimes you have a target audience that is a subgroup. Maybe it's people with a certain interest or who have need for a certain type of product. And that's who you want to focus something like a consumer study on, is who actually might buy this product. And in the case that it is a subgroup, it's really important to define that in an inclusive way. So one example I like to use is if you're doing a study looking at marketing of menstrual products, terms that we tend to see in that space a lot are women, girls, females. But that's actually not the most inclusive way to be, say, recruiting participants for a study on those products. Using a term like people who menstruate is much more inclusive of all individuals, including transgender, non-binary, and intersex individuals.
That's so interesting. Yeah, we even discuss this a lot within screeners, constantly trying to make sure that the wording is just right, because you might be thinking at first glance it was appropriate, but then realize that you're not actually asking the appropriate question, or you're not wording it the appropriate way.
The right way.
Yeah, to get it to hit what you're trying to say. For example, we had a discussion once about how you could say, what is your first language? But your first language may not be your primary language.
Right.
And, that's something you have to consider, since people, might be bilingual. They may have learned one language and then now, speak predominantly another language. So there are these discussions that have to happen continuously, and you should have these check-ins like you shared to make sure you're staying very up to date and frequent these updates, basically.
I think also just making sure you do cover the subgroups, that you can understand the subgroups better. I heard a conversation about this on NPR recently, where they were talking about research that's being done with COVID, for example, where if you, for example, were to just say Asians, right, that you actually lose a ton of data, right? So when you generalize people and you think you're being inclusive by generalizing them, you're actually losing a bunch of data that it's just being washed out, right?
Exactly. So the way that categories are defined, the way that questions are asked is super important, partly because there is appropriate and inappropriate language. But then there's also questions that are perfectly fine to ask, like first language, but it's important that that's what you actually want to get at.
Absolutely. And I think there's bias, not just in the people that are participating in research, but certainly from the researcher's perspective. Back in the day, I was in a group that was doing research, consumer research on feminine products, as they're somewhat called, right? Menstruating products. And the issue I found was I was literally the only woman in the room. And it was really awkward to be in this room talking about, olfaction and smells regarding menstruation. And this is in a room full of older men. And several of them came up to me and kept saying, oh, don't worry, I have teenage daughters. And I'm not sure that that actually helped the situation. But perhaps it explains a lot why a lot of these products perhaps could be designed better. And you see a lot more products coming out that are being designed from much more diverse researchers, right, and R&D groups. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that when it comes to like teams and who should really be, maybe helping make some of these decisions that, are inclusive and making sure your research is inclusive.
Definitely. So we talked a little bit about the participant group. But diversity is really important for the research team as well. Who is actually designing the study? Who is developing the questionnaires?
Yeah.
Who's designing the prototypes that are being tested? And who's designing the promotional materials that's then going to go out and recruit that hopefully diverse participant sample? So when the research team itself is like-minded, it can just lead to a study design that's not accessible or valuable for participants with different identities and experiences. Because we talked about bias in the brain before. So we are wired with confirmation bias, meaning that we tend to look for, prefer, and remember information that is consistent with our existing views. So if you have a team where everyone has pretty similar views, then there really isn't going to be a lot of push towards different ways of collecting and analyzing data or actively looking for contradictory findings. And that can be really important because if the typical way of analyzing data isn't inclusive or doesn't look for group differences, then nobody's really going to point that out. And that's a huge opportunity missed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it really does seem like it keeps going back to this theme that people have this, almost like we said before, the neuro myth that bias is bad. And it's almost become this taboo word that you're like, I don't have bias, but in fact, everybody has bias and it's a good thing to have that bias. It's let us evolve throughout the ages. So by really diving into that and understanding what bias is and that it's okay to have it change, is really powerful because that also shows you that people change, that we're very flexible. We've seen that in the past year that we run, all these implicit reaction tests frequently, and there's changes that happen in people as they've experienced the world. So it only makes sense to do these, like we said, these check-ins to really understand that bias isn't bad. It's actually a necessity.
I'd kind of launch off of that and kind of ask a question about what are some of the tools that people can use, whether they are, a design team or what's the best way, what are some tools that you recommend in your consulting? What do you do?
So that is highly dependent on sort of the nature of the team, what exactly they're doing. So when I work with different organizations, I always customize everything towards what field they're in, what their culture is like, and how that needs to evolve or change. But some general strategies are broadening learning. So exposure to different types of people, and not just exposure, building meaningful connections with people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, which ideally would be interpersonal connections. Given the situation we're in right now, that can be a bit more challenging to go to networking events, things like that. But consuming content from creators that come from a different field, that have different gender, racial identities, different age groups from you. That's crucial in training your brain to make associations between different types of people and traits or jobs. So for example, there was some research done, it's been going on since the 1960s, a study where children are asked to draw a picture of a scientist. And in the earliest studies, very rarely would anybody draw a scientist that presents feminine. But over time, as representation in the media and in real life, in practice, of women in science has gotten much, much higher, So has the proportion of children that will draw a scientist that presents feminine. So we can see that what we feed into our brains really impacts what comes out. So if we look for counter stereotypical examples, we get to know people on a personal and individual level. So we're not relying on group level inferences. That's key.
Absolutely. And that shows how important representation is, in our research, but also in our research teams, and deciding, who are the decision makers in this. All of those things do feed into each other. And it's really, really important that we consider that. I know from my own experiences, I'm seeing in social science, this acronym WEIRD is really coming up again, where it's, the Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries seem to really have had this main focus. And it's, they're not the majority of the world's population. So all of this social science research has been focused on them, but there's actually a lot of excitement because there's so much more research out there to try to understand human behavior from, other cultures, other disciplines, other places. And it's exciting because people sometimes look at it negatively, saying that we've been very pigeonholed, but there's so much out there to still understand and explore. And I think that we're finally getting that resurgence almost of appropriate representation through help like yours.
And I think, again, going back to like the tools, what are your thoughts on some tools that are being brought in as being, having less bias, right? Which may potentially have even more bias, but, a lot of people talk about using AI. A lot of people talk about using more voice activated or social media based research to have more outreach, right? So it's not just people that can show up at a research facility or only people on a college campus, right? That you can, use social media, or that you can use the internet to have people participate in studies, or just use AI to filter through large amounts of big data. What are your thoughts on some of the technological tools that are being introduced?
So I think the intention behind them is coming from a good place. So one of the strategies that I recommend to organizations is to limit the opportunities for your brain to take those bias shortcuts. And that can come up in many different ways depending on the type of organization, but some examples can be implementing turn taking in a meeting, or integrating structured interviews where you're guarantee that every candidate for the same position gets the same questions. So really standardizing things so your brain follows the procedure and there's no opportunity to, for example, randomly ask a question that's not on the list just because of the way that the candidate presents. So I think a lot of these technologies are coming from that intention of limiting the opportunity for those biased shortcuts. But what ends up happening is when you have biased people who are programming them and who are feeding it with biased data, because if you're feeding an algorithm with what's available online, well, what's available online is biased.
Absolutely.
And I know there's been examples of algorithms that will associate certain jobs with certain gender or racial identities because that's what they're exposed to more. And that's highly problematic. There's also been a lot of issues with facial recognition software not being as accurate on all skin colors.
Or even a lot of the physiological measures that we use, we have a lot of concerns that there can be bias with different skin colors. So, if you think about like your smartwatches, right? They actually work on what's called PPG. So you can see, well, maybe can't, but on the back, it uses light, right? Which has to reflect on your skin. And that reacts differently with different color skin. But then also, some are looking at, for example, skin conductance, and that can hugely differ on type of skin, including age, right? Or even climate. So if you're in a drier environment, or if you're older and your skin is just inherently drier, this can really affect your data.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
It's really important that any technology that's being used, whether it's AI, whether it's something taking direct measurement from a body, that those have been vetted for differences in results for different types of people. And ideally, they would be fixed so that doesn't happen, so that the accuracy is the same. At minimum, until we get to that point, is understand and control for those differences in skin conductance or whatever it may be. But that's a band-aid fix that really shouldn't be the long-term goal.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about facial coding and facial recognition. I think this is really getting to be a huge problem, because I think people have taken leaps with what they're doing with the data. And now that it's gone from being an interesting psychological study on how, facial expressions are universal. It's gone from something like that to now people want to use it in cars, right? To check whether or not someone is paying attention or sleepy. And that's really disturbing, since, researchers like us are very much more aware of the fact that facial recognition has a huge Caucasian bias, right?
Oh, yes, that's really, really concerning.
Yeah.
The racial bias is a huge issue. And also, people look different when they're in different attentive states.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna start making inferences about someone's brainwave, someone's sleep state based on where they're looking, like,
yeah, I mean, I guess if it was where they're looking, I would almost be more comfortable than their facial expression, right?
Yeah.
Because at least it's a little more accurate to say whether or not someone's actually looking at the road, right? If they're looking down or if their eyes are closed. But, to look at emotional output, that seems particularly concerning to me, because they're talking about how it might be linked with the actual function of the car, where it might shut off the car, or stop the car because it doesn't think that you're paying attention. And that seems problematic at best, right?
And there's cultural differences in facial expression too. So even if we get it to the point where it is accurate on all skin tones, the expression itself will differ across cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, one of those sort of neuro myths people have, where people start to believe that technology is going to do better than a person, right? That if they can rely on an algorithm or a machine to make the decisions, that is somehow going to remove the bias.
Right. And we've seen this also in other areas where research is exploring something to try to make things cleaner. And people always think that technology automatically means cleaner, but it also really does limit the population size. So, for example, I've seen so much research, everyone wants I'll just stick with social sciences. They want everything on an app, and you use a QR code for the app just because it's clean, but you're forgetting about people that don't have cell phones. You're forgetting about people that struggle with using technology, or maybe they're not, the elderly population is not as familiar with how to navigate these types of websites. So if you're looking to use these types of solutions, you have to remember who these solutions are geared towards and who you're leaving out of the solution, because there are going to be ripple effects of that, of that implementation of that QR code or whatever it may be in your study.
Yeah, I do wonder how much of research, at least market research in particular, is going to change, because I think, in these COVID times, a lot of people shifted to more online research and doing online interviews. But this does require a level of availability and internet savvy, right, that not everybody has access to. And so it could shift a lot of the understanding we have about consumers and how we're going to market to people.
Yeah. And it becomes, that always brings up the conversation of privilege within it, because if you're privileged enough to have really strong Wi-Fi with a large bandwidth, then you're going to have exposure to so much more information and so much more opportunity than somebody that may not have that, that same,
or have products that
tools.
are no longer speaking to you, right? Because the research was based on somebody else.
Absolutely. But we really do think that these are conversations that have to keep happening. And I feel like there is a push right now to try to get this understanding. It's also been seen on the flip side where it's been, I've seen it with, the LGBTQ plus community that, Pride, they had this whole thing about rainbow washing and how people were just throwing it on. And it's like you said, it's a Band-Aid and it's a poorly made Band-Aid to try to actually deal with the, different ways to try to be more inclusive. So we need people like you to try to help guide and lead the way for understanding how to best navigate this really complex world.
Yeah, on the topic of the rainbow washing, and we've seen similar things happening in different times of the year and targeted towards different identities. And it's really important that those are backed up with action within the organization. Because I do think that it's important to have representation in media, in organizational communications. But that needs to demonstrate and to sort of be the outward facing representation of what's happening inside of, you're maybe showing people of different identities using a product, but the product has to actually have been tested with people of all identities and demonstrated to be safe, valuable, and appealing. Otherwise, then the communication is just performative, and people, especially the more it happens, can really just see right through it. So that's usually something that I recommend as a later step. Figure out what's happening within the organization. Make sure the products and services are actually for everybody. And then focus on the communications. And really importantly is including people of all identities in all communications, not just those that are focused on diversity.
And not just during a certain time of the year.
Exactly.
We're not on a schedule right now. I think
a follow-up. I mean, it's being authentic, right? I think when you were talking just now, the word authenticity really came to mind. So it's not just, putting up the rainbow flag or whatever it might be during that particular time of year, but what are you actually doing about it, right? Following it with an action, how you've actually changed your research protocol or the makeup of your research team, whatever it might be.
Exactly. Always action first, and then representation and showing what you've done. Because at that point, it's not a marketing ploy or anything like that. It's being real and it's saying, this is what we've done. And that's what people are looking for right now. They're not looking for, more flags, more, statements, more, we support this group, sort of generic social media posts. Those can have their place and complement to other initiatives, but people want to see, they want to see data. They want to see the demographics of your participants that you tested your product or your experience with. They want to see who's on the research team. And that's something that I do work with organizations on as well, is data collection. We do assessments. So we actually look at what's going on in the organization. What are your team members saying? What are they experiencing? What do they need? And then analyzing that in a scientific way. So as objectively as possible, so we minimize bias as much as we can, look at the data and say, this is where we need to take some action. This is some of the issues, some of the areas of strength, all based on what the team members are actually saying.
So I have to say this area of, while I'm familiar with, inclusion and these sort of ideas, bringing it into the neuroscience realm is newer to me. What is, some comments you could make about this as a field?
So I think that the whole cross between neuro and inclusion is quite new. And I'm really excited to sort of be one of the first people to be getting into this, because there's so much we can do with it. Because as we were saying before, everything comes from and goes through the brain. So if we really want to get at behavior, at why people act the way that they do, then we need to be integrating neuroscience research into this. Part of what I do is translating the neuroscience research. There's tons of it happening in universities and other institutions internationally. And I think bringing a lot of that research into the organizations is crucial. So for example, there is neuroimaging research. So you can actually see bias happening in the brain. You can see different brain waves when people look at faces of people who have a same or different race from their own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when we use that as a foundation to say, this is real, this is happening, you get a lot less of the, I'm not biased, I'm one of the good ones. It's like, no, this is happening in your brain. You don't see it, you don't feel it, but it's real. And I think that's where the intersection is really gonna come into play. And the cognitive diversity part too, when we realize that, yes, all of our brains share some similarities, but we are different. Mm-hmm. And when you show the same thing, whether it's a product, a piece of music, a commercial, whatever it might be, you can show the same thing to different people and they will process it differently. And I think when organizations start taking that into account, both with consumers and with their own teams, you'll just diversify all of the different ideas that you can have when you stop expecting people to sort of react in the same way and to behave in the same way. We're going to open up our organizations to just being so much more innovative. And I do think that it's the organizations that really embrace that are going to be taking much more steps forward, especially now as we're seeing situations evolving again and people being critical of their own workplaces in a lot of ways.
So a question I would have for you, for people who are wanting to make this change, there's organizational level change, right? Which is going to be a lot of the higher up leaders. But when it comes to someone who is simply writing the screener for a survey, right? Or deciding what demographics and how to describe those demographics, or how to find the subgroups, these sort of things, outside of contacting you directly, and we have your information linked below. So outside of, hiring a consultant like yourself, what are some resources people can go to find what's the correct wording to ask someone about gender, and how can we be more inclusive in thinking about different cognitive biases or cognitive functions, or, all sorts of different diversity that we have among different types of people? How can we be more inclusive in how we ask our questions? What's a good resource?
So interesting you mentioned, I'm actually working on a very comprehensive resource list that's going to have a bunch of resources on those topics. So I'd be happy to share that with you when it's all ready. There's so many, to just pick out a couple right now would be singling some out. So I think we're going to hold out until I get that list done, but it's coming soon.
Awesome.
In general, one thing that I always suggest is look up multiple sources as well, and always look into sources or suggestions from people who identify in certain groups. Mm-hmm. So, for example, how to phrase a question about disability, look for sources that are written by people with disabilities. And it's important to understand, in some cases, there really isn't an objective right or wrong. There are often a lot of rights. So it depends, again, what you're trying to get at, and the communities being referred to. It can differ by region as well. Mm-hmm. So always providing more options is always better than providing less, because when people see their identity reflected, it means that they're seen. Mm-hmm. And another general suggestion is avoid othering. So avoid using the term other. I always suggest, prefer to self-describe, and then leave an open space.
I like that. Yeah, I think that's a good recommendation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really, insightful. And I was not surprised because I knew having you on, we would learn a lot, but it really is something that we're grateful that you gave your time to help us really understand and dive into these really, really important topics and really try to take from this and implement it now into everyone's everyday lives.
And as more information comes in, when you develop those lists, we are going to be really happy to use those resources and happy to share them as well. So really looking forward to you sharing them in the future. And I love the work that you're doing. So again, yeah, thank you very much. People that are interested, check out the description below and how you can contact Falisha. And of course, follow, like, comment on this vidcast and feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to speak with you both.
You as well. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Take care. HCD Mindset is produced by Helen Ross. For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.